Hello, welcome to the latest episode of Harmonious World. And I'm joined today by Gavin Bryars, British composer of what we would generally call experimental music, but it's so much wider than that. Gavin is predominantly a double bass player, but as early as the 1970s, he worked as a composer and a performer with people he describes as composer friends, such as John White, Dave Smith, and Christopher Hobbs, writing and playing each other's music. One of my favourite pieces is The Sinking of the Titanic, which is deeply, deeply moving. And in fact, that's going to be performed on July the 20th as part of the Cambridge Summer Music Festival. There's a link in the show notes to Cambridge Summer Music. Gavin will be performing on bass alongside Morgan Goff on viola, Nick Cooper, Audrey Riley and Orlando Bryars on cello, and James Woodrow on electric guitar. Meanwhile, I hope you enjoy my conversation with Gavin. Thank you for joining me on Harmonious World.
You're welcome. It's very nice.
Yeah, it's a real pleasure. And I have discovered that tickets are on sale very soon for your 2 concerts with Cambridge Summer Music. So that's going to be quite an exciting night. It was great of Andrew Barashko to put us in touch. That was really great. So
Andrew's a good friend. I've known Andrew for a long time.
Right.
We've worked together. I've done arrangements for the Art of Time and so on. Yeah, it's great.
Yeah, and that's such an amazing ensemble, isn't it?
Lovely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Can we start with your start? So why did you start on the double bass?
I always loved the double bass. I always wanted to play it. I grew up in a small town in East Yorkshire where really nothing happened. There was no visiting companies, no theatre, no concert hall. So everything that happened there was done on an amateur level. There was I was at school there. My mother was an amateur cellist, but in fact, in the town where I grew up, there was no double bass. There simply wasn't an instrument there. But as a even quite young, I would listen always to the bass lines of songs. And later, when I started to become interested in jazz, it was a bass I followed all the time because I was interested in the harmonic progressions, the lines, and so on, rather than the tunes or the words. And so it was only when I went to university in Sheffield, age 18, that I found in the music department down in the basement was a double bass. It was very neglected. The strings were slack. One string was broken. There were cracks. The bridge was falling off, and so on. But I asked if the staff there, if I were to, fix it up, could I use the bass? And they said, of course. And so I fixed it. I started practicing and playing, and little by little, I started playing with university jazz groups. And within a year, more or less, I was actually working professionally. And at the same time, sort of trying to maintain some sort of semblance of attendance at my philosophy courses. Yeah.
Yes, because that's an interesting story. I read that you were studying philosophy, but you became a professional musician in that time, which is it's quite extraordinary. But at that time, I think you were a little older than me, but certainly when I was at university, there weren't jazz courses. You couldn't go to university and study jazz.
No, I didn't study jazz.
No, that's what I mean. But that wasn't an option.
Not at all. I mean, I played jazz and studied jazz, as was the tradition throughout history until much later, by playing with other jazz musicians and listening to jazz. And so you learned it pragmatically, and you learn what works, and you make your mistakes, and you make a fool of yourself sometimes. You find yourself in the wrong song, the wrong harmony. You've got to remember the chord changes for so many old jazz standards. It's part of the life of the jazz musician at that time. Certainly was you knew all the songs, and you could play them in all the keys. You knew what key it was normally in, but you could do it all.
Yeah, fantastic. But then you moved, and you became much more of an experimental musician. So you moved away from the standards, if you like.
Yeah. Well, within the jazz I was playing, I was working with 2 very fine improvisers, Derek Bailey and Tony Oxley, and the group that we had. We moved gradually from standard jazz to free jazz to completely free improvisation, and it became much more experimental. And we were out in the sticks. We were in Sheffield, so people didn't really hear us. There were no recordings, no broadcasts. but we were probably the first people in England anyway to be playing in this free way. But I became disenchanted with improvised music, and in 1966 I stopped playing and developed more interest in other areas of experimental music, especially the work of John Cage. And I met Cage, and eventually I worked with him in America.
Oh, I didn't know that. Wow, that must have been an amazing experience.
That was terrific. I met Cage when he was with Merce Cunningham in 1966 for the second time the Cunningham Company came to London. And a friend sort of dragged me backstage. We should go say hello to Merce Cunningham and John Cage. I was embarrassed, but I went through it. And Cage was absolutely charming. He was pleased to meet us. He asked me what kind of thing I was doing. He asked to see some scores, and I came back later during the run of the dance company, and he took some of these scores with graphic notations, and they're in a collection in Illinois, a collection of notations that he collected. And it's to my massive embarrassment, those pieces still exist. And with any luck, I would have burnt them by now, but Cage took them, and he took them seriously. And he was a really terrific person. And when I went to America, I went there to work with some dancers. I happened to bump into Cage in New York at a concert, and he remembered me. This was 2 years later. And it turned out we were going to be living in the same city at Champaign-Urbana, which is the university town of Illinois. And he was working there on a 2-year fellowship. And so I ended up doing some sort of assistant work for him.
Wow, how amazing. That's a fantastic experience, I'm sure.
Yeah.
And in your work, you're obviously drawn to the lower string sound.
Yeah, well, I think it's partly my DNA. My mother was an amateur cellist. My father was an amateur bass baritone singer. My uncle was a church organist. I play the bass. My 2 eldest daughters play the cello. My 3rd daughter plays the viola and piano. My son plays the bass. There were no violins in the family. And when I did my first orchestral piece, the opera Medea, I removed the violins from the orchestra altogether. And with my 2 eldest children, when they were very young, 2.5, my ex-wife, my wife at the time, wanted them to do Suzuki music. And I thought, well, the idea of a 2.5-year-old playing a squeaky violin was horrible to me. But if they were squeaking a couple of octaves lower, it wasn't too bad. So they started on the cello at 2.5, and then gradually moved up. So my whole feeling has been for the lower sounds.
Yeah. And that comes across. There's a real resonance. Yes. That it gets right into your heart, doesn't it? And I really have to talk to you about the sinking of the Titanic.
Sure.
That's one of the pieces that you're going to be performing in Cambridge in July.
Yes. What
made you create that piece? Because it's an absolutely, I mean, it sends shivers down my spine even talking about it, let alone listening to it. And the only performance that I've heard is the Trinity Laban one, which I think was from about 3 or 4 years ago. Oh. But it's really gets deep into your soul, doesn't it? So what inspired you, first of all, to write that piece?
Well, I started it in 1969 when I was actually teaching in the fine art department in Portsmouth. I'd been in America in 1968. And in fact, friends tell me I actually mentioned the idea of a piece about the Titanic, even when I was in America, but I have no recollection of that. But a lot of the students I worked with, the fine art students, who were people who were involved in events and happenings and that kind of thing, rather than painting and sculpture. Some of them were a little bit under attack because they were doing kind of conceptual art and so on. And so there was an exhibition of their work, and they asked those staff who were sympathetic to put something in. I put this 1-page sketch, an idea for the sinking of the Titanic. And to my mind, that was almost like the kind of initial score, because it talked about the basis of the piece being the music the ship's orchestra were playing as the ship went down and so on. And so in my mind, it was a kind of conceptual piece of music which you could invent and create in your mind just from the information I gave. But eventually, a chap who organised concerts in London, Victor Schonfield, said, well, that's all very fine, Gavin, but what would happen if we all heard it at the same time? So what would happen if you put it into a concert space? So I then was, as I say, hoisted on my own petard, and then I did make a version, which we did live. Then I had to go into very practical research about one thing was, what was the hymn the band played? What were the instruments? And I found, and I looked at the Board of Trade reports. I had photographs of the musicians. I knew what instruments they played. I knew their names. I knew where they came from. And I knew what I believed to be the piece of music from a report by the wireless operator who remembers hearing it when he was in the water about 150 feet away from the ship as it was going down. And so I developed the whole piece was developed from researching into sort of factual information, which could in some way translate into performance. It wasn't just a kind of an academic thesis. Everything was in there could exist within some sort of performance context. So there were things which I didn't use because I could see no way in which they could be incorporated. But many other things were incorporated, like all sorts of sounding events and images. And I had the idea about what happens. Clearly, the band were playing as the ship went down, but I imagined what would happen if the music continued after they'd gone under the water. Technically, of course, they couldn't be still playing string instruments under the water, but I had the idea that the music started and somehow it then went into the ocean and was sort of sealed in this vast space, this vast resonant ocean, and then it sinks to the bottom of the ocean 5 miles or so deep at a place at that time we didn't know where it was. Later, of course, the ship was discovered. So it's this kind of mythic and rather kind of almost metaphoric space where these events took place. And each time I made the piece, in those days, I would find something else or something else would occur to me. I remember when eventually I stopped playing it for a while after I made the first recording for Brian Eno's Obscure Records label. That was the first actual recording. And I stopped playing it for a while. Then I was persuaded to play it again in the late 80s. Well, actually 1990. But by then, of course, the ship had been found. So what was previously a myth was now a reality. We had pictures, we had images. And one thing, for example, I knew that on the ship, from my information, that there was a young Scottish engineer who was an amateur filmmaker. He'd filmed a sort of near collision of the ship when it was leaving Southampton. But he also played the piano in the sort of the third class accommodation for Sunday service. But he was also an amateur bagpipe player. So I knew there was a bagpipe player on there. And then there on the ocean floor, when I saw this footage, there was a set of bagpipes, but they were Irish pipes. So there were two bagpipe players on the Titanic. So because of that, I then wrote a kind of a pipe lament, a kind of like a pibroch lament for bass clarinet to represent this occurrence. And that's the kind of thing that things would come up and then they get moved into the music.
Oh, that's
so in a way, almost everything I've put in there is factual. In a way, in some ways, you could say there's very little composing going on. I'm constructing things, I'm assembling things out of data and making judgments about how they can combine. But the things themselves, the elements themselves, are justified by their existence in the real world, as it were.
Right. Gosh, that must have been interesting to do that research, especially then, because obviously a lot has come out since, and obviously, the big blockbuster film and all the rest of it. But I only discovered quite recently, I watched a documentary and it was saying that James Cameron only made the film Titanic because he had been so passionate about the research into the sinking of the Titanic.
Yes.
So
by that time, I'd made a second recording, and I remember the record company got in touch with James Cameron because they were trying to commercially get a few minutes into his film, and Cameron got back in touch, and he knew my work and liked it, but he'd made the decision to only use one composer, which is James Horner, for everything. And I respected that, but we respected each other. And I knew, for example, that Kate Winslet was not on the Titanic at all, so we differed on that.
Very good. Another piece that I really, really love is When Harry Met Addie.
Oh, gosh, that's a surprise.
Well, John Sermon is a superb baritone sax player.
No question.
And I happened to meet him and interview him a few years ago. And when I saw that, when I realized I was going to be able to interview you, I remembered that piece, which I must have heard years ago. So tell me how that happened. So John commissioned that, is that right?
Indirectly, John was a person who he didn't put up the money, but he did commission it. I don't think John's that wealthy.
No.
But it was the Duke Ellington centenary, and he was involved with a project with the London Sinfonietta to do a centenary program about Ellington, and they created a sort of London Sinfonietta big band, which is essentially a large jazz big band. And I got to know Duke Ellington's singer Adelaide Hall. I got to know her in the mid 1980s, and she was the singer, the first of Ellington's singers, and she created the song Creole Love Call in 1926. I knew her when we worked together. She was almost 90, and I did some concerts with her, and I loved her voice, and she was a terrific personality. And I had this idea of having this. The way that she created Creole Love Call was it wasn't a song at that time. The band we were playing, and she was like scat singing in the wings, and so this became the piece. So I had this idea of this offstage scat singer who would gradually come onto the stage, and of course that I made this kind of jokey title was that Harry Carney was the baritone sax player, and I thought, as John's a baritone sax, I'll just involve that. So I had making the jokey title When Harry Met Addie, after the famous movie. Yeah.
Yes, and Harry Carney was just a stunning player, wasn't he?
He was, though in fact I found that when I did it, that quite a lot of sax players find Harry Carney's playing rather kind of mannered and old-fashioned, but techniques move on. But within the Ellington band, he was terrific. In fact, the thing about Ellington bands always was that they were all great individualists. You know, he created the things for these people. It wasn't, say, like the Count Basie band, which is a great band, but you could replace a sax player and nothing would change, but you can't replace Johnny Hodges or Harry Carney in the same way.
Exactly. I was involved in a film about Tubby Hayes a few years ago.
Who played with Ellington.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, all of these things, they sort of interweave, don't they?
Yes. I remember when I was actually a teenager, I was 18, I hitchhiked with some friends down to the Bewley Jazz Festival in Hampshire, and I saw Tubby Hayes playing live on stage, playing tenor sax. And I remember at one point he was playing this great solo, playing terrifically, and he took a deep breath, and I think a fly got into his mouth, and he staggered for a moment. And that was the perils of playing outdoors.
Yeah,
but he was a great player. I remember we used to sort of secretly hitchhike down to London and places like that, and tell our parents we were at our friend's house or something. And I remember seeing Tubby Hayes at Ronnie Scott's in maybe 1961.
Yeah. He's one of those players that he's missed. A lot of people have no idea who he is, but he's just, I mean, to be able to step in and play with Ellington like that, you know,
and also to have gained Ellington's respect. Ellington wouldn't invite just anybody in. He would probably have rather done without a sax player, invite the wrong person. So I think it says a lot of how Tubby was viewed. I mean, he was also a very good vibes player as well.
Oh yes, well, and flute.
Yeah.
He taught himself flute apparently in a day or a couple of days.
Well, that's not hard. That's not hard. The flute's not like
That's true.
It goes in your pocket. Come on.
That's true. Now, on the 20th of July, when you're in Cambridge, the first session is built around the sinking of the Titanic, and the second event is built around Jesus' Blood Never Failed Me Yet.
Yeah.
I've got a question about that, which is, are you using the original loop of the singer, or is somebody else going to sing live?
The piece is only allowed to be done with that original loop. There have been people who sung it, but it's not permitted by me or by the publisher. The only time I did allow it was when I worked with Tom Waits on the second recording. That was at my invitation. But after that, both Tom and I said to Tom, I'm not to have anyone else play it. In fact, in the published score, there is express prohibition of anyone even attempting to that. I invoke hellfire, peril, and Tom coming around with a broken bottle. So there's no way. It does happen, but it will be the original loop, and I've obviously preserved that digitally now.
Right. Yeah. And how did you come across it? So this was a guy singing in outside Waterloo Station.
It was a friend. I was involved a little bit with so-called underground cinema in the late 60s and early 70s, and there was a friend, Alan Power, who helped finance quite a lot of that work. He was a producer, but he decided to make a film of his own, which was about people living rough. Living on the streets around, say, Waterloo and Elephant and Castle, that sort of place. And I wasn't involved in the film at all, but he brought a number of tapes, audio tapes for me to help him mix and so on. And so when he'd done all the work he needed to do, he gave me the tapes, big tapes that I could use as blank tapes. And at that time, a big reel of, half a quarter-inch tape cost a bit, and we didn't have much money. So I had these tapes, and for some reason, normally I would just use those to record over them or erase them or whatever. But for some reason, I listened to the whole of a tape on headphones. And in fact, the tape machine belonged to Dave Holland, the bass player, who left to join Miles Davis. And he left his tape machine with Evan Parker, who was my next door neighbor, and this one with this horrible house in Kilburn. And so it was Dave Holland's machine, and it was resting on an old cymbalom that had belonged to Evan Parker's father. And I remember, I think it was a Sunday night, I remember this thing was there, and I put on the headphones and I listened. And there was this tape, people, all these old men, there's no women there, who were all talking about their lives, about how they'd come to where they were. And at that time, you would say that a homeless old man was almost like a culture apart. It's not like the homeless now, which can be just young people whose homes have been repossessed, all kind of things. Then you even had a word tramps, which you would never use now. And they were living on the street. Sometimes they would break into song or tell stories. Sometimes the song was a pop song or extract of opera or some popular ballad. And almost all of them were drunk, almost all. But in the middle of this, there was this short fragment, 26 seconds long, where this man broke into song. He sang this religious fragment, Jesus' blood never failed me yet. And it transpired afterwards, I found out that he was the only one out of all the one they met who didn't drink at all. He was simply down on his luck. Yet he was old. He didn't have long to live, according to what the film people told me. But there's no images of him because he wasn't put in the film. This tape was being thrown away. It was in the waste bin. So all that remains of this old man is this 26 seconds of song. Now, I was raised in the Christian church. My mother ran a Sunday school. I had an uncle who was a minister. Another uncle was a church organist. So I knew religious music. I mean, even now, although I'm no longer a practicing Christian, I'll go to a funeral or a wedding or something or a Christmas carol service, and I know them all. I don't have to look at the music. But I didn't know this one at all. It was new to me. So I found that the way this man sang it, the ending naturally led to the beginning. And at that time, I was doing a lot of work with tape loops. It was a thing which a number of experimental people were doing. And so I made a loop, and it so went round and round. And as it happened, his singing was perfectly in tune with my piano. I don't know whether he had perfect pitch or it was just a fluke. He was rock solid in A major. And so I could just quietly accompany, just play the chords and keep playing with him. And I had this idea of developing it where the piece would go on, and little by little, I would add things as a way of sort of supporting the voice, not to overwhelm it or even to show how clever I am with orchestration, but just to give this voice a little bit of a lift, because I found in this old man's voice real musicality, but also many other things which still strike me. There's a kind of a dignity about him. I think there's a certain lightness. I can even imagine him smiling as he's singing. There's a sort of a humanity, there's a warmth. And even now, when I play this piece, and I'm actually conducting it with the orchestra in Tasmania in about 3 weeks' time. When I be standing there in front of an orchestra, for 2 or 3 minutes, this voice will gradually fade in. And even now, 50 years after I first heard it, it still touches me. And I must have heard it hundreds of thousands of times, that little fragment, because when we made the second version with Tom Waits in New York, the producer calculated that during the whole time we'd been making this recording, we'd heard that loop 14,000 times. So if we did that during the period of one recording, imagine how many times I've heard it since I first heard it. There were years when I wasn't playing it, but it must be close to 1 million over 50 years. But even so, whenever I heard it, even now, I'm still touched by it. Yeah. And I think there's just that intrinsic power and hard to identify quality about something that still grabs you. It's partly maybe because he doesn't sing completely accurately in terms of rhythm. It's a bit of give and take. There is a little bit of ambience in the background, as if there's like some sort of traffic noise or something. So it doesn't sound like a perfect tape, and I've never tried to clean the tape up. But whatever it is, it still sounds fresh to me.
Wow. I think that's a perfect place to finish, actually.
Fine.
Thank you so much for sharing those stories behind those pieces and your background and everything. It's just amazing. And I'm looking forward to, I'm going to buy tickets to both concerts because, well,
originally the idea was to do one concert because Freya Goldmark, who's artistic director of the festival, her father, Mike Goldmark, has a gallery nearby me in Uppingham. And I did two special versions of both the Titanic and Jesus Blood to be performed in that gallery with a small ensemble instead of the large groups that I would normally use. So it's just a small 6 players, each one lasting round about half an hour or just under. So it's not the sort of large scale thing that you would normally experience in a large concert hall. So these are like chamber versions, and we did them in the Goldmark Gallery. And Freya was very struck and thought she'd like to bring these in, but we decided, I think partly her idea was, but it's not a bad idea, to split them into 2. So you have one in one concert and make each concert an hour or so and have a gap in between. So we can have a bite to eat, but probably nothing to drink.
Yeah, no, that's right. I can imagine that, this is quite intricate stuff. It's not simple music, is it?
It's not simple. I mean, on one level it is simple. The actual notes you play, you don't need a massive technique, but you have to have a certain kind of control and a sense of ensemble, because a lot of it's happening very slowly. And I do like the way in which a very slow ensemble can still have coherence. It doesn't have to be ragged. If you hear a great jazz player like Bill Evans playing a very slow ballad, it still swings even at a very, very, very slow tempo. And that's a real sign of greatness. It's easy to swing when you're playing fast. Swinging when you're playing slow is hard.
Yeah. Fantastic. Thank you so much for joining me. That was a real honor to speak to you.
Thank you, Hilary. It's a pleasure. Take
Brilliant.
care.
I really hope you enjoyed listening to my conversation with Gavin Bryars. As always, please do check out his music. All the links are in the show notes. And I've also included a link to Cambridge Summer Music. If you enjoy listening to Harmonious World, please do share it with your friends, family. You could either do that on social media or send the link with a personal message, perhaps. Please also consider leaving a review on whichever podcast platform you listen on. It really makes a difference. So thank you so much for listening to Harmonious World. I hope you have a wonderful week wherever you are. Please remember to share what you are good at to make this world a little more harmonious. Thank you for listening to the latest episode of Harmonious World. My name is Hilary Seabrook, and it's a great delight to bring this series of discussions with musicians and composers and writers and all sorts of people to you. Obviously, there's no point in having a podcast if people aren't listening, and I'm very grateful to my listeners for doing so. Thanks also to Joe English for composing and performing this new theme tune. So wherever you get your podcast, you can leave a review. You can share this with your friends and family, either as a link or on social media and that sort of thing. I'd be really grateful for that. Don't forget that you can subscribe now. There's a link wherever you get your podcasts. So have a great week, and please remember why I started this, which is just to try and make the world a little more harmonious. Thanks for listening to Harmonious World.